Arab Muslim immigrants in Europe, called The Other Threat. He is founding editor of the Arab Studies Journal, which is published by Georgetown and is a very well-regarded journal, and a founding editor, and you still work with them. That's correct. He also serves on the editorial committee of the Middle East Report, where I have the privilege of working with him. Many people have gotten to know him lately as the co-founder and editor of Jadaliyya e-zine, which has seemed much more than e-zine, and this has really become, over the last year or so, a source of information that is updated constantly about the Middle East, that everyone... Oh, okay. All right. Not used to... Okay. That everyone is reading 1,000, I don't know, you get 10,000, a million hits per day, and he has managed to mobilize and inspire dozens of people to work very hard and for free to produce this amazing zine. He's also, I think, one of the finest observers of contemporary Syria. And if you check out, for instance, a piece that he published on Jadaliyya yesterday, you'll get a sense of how careful he is, how engaged he is, how extremely well-informed. He doesn't say or write anything about Syria unless it is really, really well documented. And he's very brave and bold in the kinds of things that he says and writes about Syria. He's the author of numerous articles, and finally, or I should say academic articles. Yes. And finally, he's the author of Business Networks in Syria, the Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, which he's going to talk about today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. At some point, I have to cut down my bio. Taking time away from talking about important things. I brought with me a shirt. Would you be comfortable if I keep my T-shirt and the jacket, or would you like to wear
Just change it.
here? No, I'm glad. It's okay. I won't wear the shirt. It was just too hot for me to wear both. But I thought, since we're at Georgetown and everything, we should look dignified, which I don't really care for much. I am, beyond honored to be here. This is, for me, much more so than a talk, and it's much more so than an intellectual exercise. Actually, I don't want to get too emotional because I can. At this moment, largely because I see in the audience some people that I've worked with for about 20 years, and that have been extremely supportive in so many ways. I see Dr. Stowasser, who has been here much longer than
since Adam.
And has been extremely supportive, and of course Dr. Hudson and Dr. Tucker, who are not here, have been always behind me every step of the way. But a very big thanks and a very big warm greeting goes to Dr. Halim Barakat, who actually ushered me into the program in 1992. And when I saw him here, I was going to break into tears. So,
Thank you.
thanks for coming. And of course, his lovely wife, who has always been with us every step of the way. So I really, I'm very happy to be here and very honored. Thanks, Ed, for this really fantastic introduction. That's very sweet of you. Not just, the text, but your input as well. I will talk here about the book, not about the Syrian revolution. I've been talking about the Syrian revolution for a long time, and I can easily do this, and we can move this into such a discussion, but I think it will be unfair because the background to what we are witnessing is very much part and parcel of what I was trying to do in the past 15 years. When I started the research on the political economy of Syria, in 1994, the incentive was to explain the patterns of development in particular countries that are in the Arab world and beyond in the developing world, but also to highlight some of the problems that are likely to bring about, were likely to bring about further underdevelopment and further polarization, which I never thought would produce a kind of mass mobilization that we are witnessing today at that speed. Actually, had it not been for the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions, I doubt that the Syrian population, or much of it, would have gone to the streets in 2011. That is not to say that this was not likely to happen in the coming years, especially as a result of dwindling oil resources and oil finds and perhaps even gas finds, although gas finds have been increasing during the past few years. But not only as a result of this, but also as a result of the continuing drought and scant rainfall in Syria that is producing, to date, more than 1.5 million migrants, at least, from the countryside to the city, which is part and parcel why the uprising took place, in the sense that that has caused even more strain on a country that has a decrepit infrastructure, has dwindled, has reduced welfare subsidies, and where unemployment is on the rise, let alone other matters that we will discuss. So that would have produced some sort of mass mobilization down the line, but certainly not in 2011, which is perhaps why this uprising is far more protracted than its counterparts in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and one can say Yemen and Bahrain, except that Yemen and Bahrain, you had the opposite effect of the international community, to some extent, or its most powerful players, along with its local and regional allies in the Gulf, tried to either crush it, suppress it, or transit the revolution into a transition that seems acceptable, but it really is not in the case of Yemen. Now, I'll stop here and go back to the question of the book. It's on business networks in Syria, the political economy of authoritarian resilience. The cause or the intent of the book is to talk about political economy of development and its problems, and then to also explain authoritarianism without, of course, a reference or some sort of a regression to either culturalist analysis or purely political analysis that does not get at the mechanics of authoritarianism, specifically how the state shifts alliances from the more leftist populist coalition that emerged in post-colonial times to the more right-wing pro-business and narrower coalition that emerged after the mid-1980s when Syria encountered a serious economic crisis and began shifting alliances. And political economy is really all about social alliances and social power. Hanna Batatu, the late Hanna Batatu, who used to teach here and from whom I learned so much, used to always ask the question first and foremost, where does social power come from? And how does that translate into everything else? And what is the impact, weight, and size of this variable in relation to other variables? So he also taught us, all of us who were in that cohort, to emphasize the importance of social power and social class, but never to reduce politics to social class, and actually to recognize the importance of combining class and status and other variables in order to understand what is happening. However, he would continuously say, and it's published in one of his, in my view, sacred lines in his book on Iraq, that without this element, without the understanding social class, however, it's very difficult to understand what is happening, say, in the case of Iraq, in the case of Syria, and certainly today in the case of the United States. So this is the spirit with which I wrote the book, and in this case, I wanted to look at the mechanics of authoritarianism in order to understand its resilience, especially in Syria. And I looked at state-business relations, specifically because that was the social alliance that the regime moved to in order to keep itself afloat at the expense of the state itself, the business community as a whole itself, because it's connected only with part of the business community, and finally, at the expense of the Syrian people. And all of this actually amounts to a discussion about how state-business relations in Syria and this particular regime that has basically supposedly a socialist rhetoric, or has had a socialist rhetoric, is indeed a state capitalist system and a regime that adopted neoliberalism almost under the table, and actually produced horrendous outcomes socially that go against everything that the Baath or anything that smacks of the left is. So it went all very much against its own ideological and rhetorical basis early on. And I wanted to also finish this thought by saying that all of these outcomes ultimately undermined the developmental potential of Syria, which actually happened in various other countries in the region, and that is the clincher here. Particularly, it undermined the productive base of the Syrian economy, which means that even if Jesus Christ and Prophet Muhammad take over the state in Syria, they're going to have problems running the state, because the infrastructure, the manufacturing base, the irrigation systems, and various other elements in the Syrian economy have been basically not demolished, but have been run into the ground. So it's a very sad story that we don't think about sometimes when we think about just authoritarianism and the need to remove an authoritarian regime. There are deeper problems at hand, whoever takes over. And in this sense, of course, the people that might take over also make us think even twice about how these problems are going to be resolved, because it's not extremely encouraging at this point. So I will go over a number of things that I've discussed in the book, and perhaps a bit rather quickly, so we can probably have some time for discussion. So I will be skipping through some of these slides on the book, the findings, and both empirical and theoretical. I discussed that this book is really about how state and business actors come together, but the issue is that they come together informally to form economic networks that are related to, whereby various individuals and groups are related together in network form, and then shape patterns of state intervention in the economy. And that basically is the kernel of the objective of the book. And the reason I emphasize networks is because for the most part, the question of class is important, of course, but class and other attributes of human beings or of societies are just that, are attributes. And one of the problems of leftist, Marxist, orthodox thinking, and of course of other kinds of thinking, but I think if you critique, even independent Marxist thinking, you are actually somewhere, because if you fix that, you really have gone an extra mile. The problem with some of this analysis is that it focuses on attributes. A class attribute is basically your socioeconomic position within an economic or socioeconomic ladder, which is important and structural and cannot be neglected, as every analyst of that ilk has demonstrated. However, the problem with it is that it does not take into consideration the relationships between people that have different attributes or even the same attributes. In other words, network analysis can leave room if you are approaching it from a progressive and critical point of view, not from a more sort of a liberal right-wing point of view. But if you approach it from a progressive and critical point of view, network analysis allows us to account for a class position, but also account for the relationship between any two actors, which means that it places emphasis, or you can place emphasis on class attributes, upper class, middle class, working class, what have you. But it also places fundamental importance on the relationship between two nodes, or between two, I'm not going to use network language, but between two actors. That relationship has an explanatory value over and beyond the attributes of the people within that relationship. And that is missing, not just in class analysis, but it's also missing in most social and political analysis that focus excessively on either structure or institutions or even strategies. So network analysis cuts through, and of course including rational choice and methodological individualism. So network analysis cuts through all of these approaches to allow us to understand that the relationship between two people is itself a variable that must be taken into consideration in explaining outcomes. It's not who you are and who the other person is, or who you are as an institution or a group and who the other groups or institutions or individuals are. It's also the relationship. And that relationship explains some of the outcomes that have been left unexplained and are reduced sometimes to culture or whatever other black box that could be found to explain residual outcomes that are not clear where they came from. And it's very important for us here, in my view, to think about this variable as we talk about Syria and as we talk about other cases in the region and as we talk about the United States, including what happened in the economic basically situation, the downfall, the decline, the crash in 2008 and after. And it does have a lot to do with the relationship, which has its own independent impact on behavior and independent impact on outcomes. So this is my quick spiel about networks, and it's actually in the introduction where I break this down into component parts. What sparked my interest early on is very simple observation. In the early 1990s, when I was thinking that I would like to study political Islam, and which I did during my master's years, and I was not actually satisfied that studying political Islam will help me understand what is going on in the region. I thought I would like to go to what I considered a deeper level of analysis that explains phenomenon that rise, whether it's Arab nationalism or political Islam or what have you. And so I became interested in political economy. And then I observed that Arab countries, of course, lag far behind various other countries, which is not a very tough to make as an observation, specifically by looking at countries like South Korea, which were in the 1950s at the same level economically and so on as Egypt was, and it's probably more comparable with Egypt than it is with Syria. However, after 30 years, South Korea achieved remarkable economic growth, and Egypt, for various reasons, stagnated. We can talk between now and the end of time about how the Middle East is under more specific constraints that having to do with the basically the existence of the most important energy resource on earth, and how this makes it a very coveted region, and how the Arab-Israeli conflict also affects development within the region. Also how the region itself exists in a very strategic place, which makes it a high-value area and increases international attention to it and interference and so on. However, there are variables beyond these that also are important to look at, and they have a lot to do with how internally various societies are structured. And these variables might be connected to external variables. For instance, Korea, or in South Korea, the East Asian tigers succeeded not just because of the cultural arguments that people made about the Southeast Asian countries. They also succeeded because of the dramatic levels of capital inflows from Western countries, specifically from the United States, as a way to stem the tide of communism at the time. And it had a lot to do with this, mixed with internal variables, to produce what can be called embedded autonomy, as Peter Evans called, or other forms of economic collaboration within the state between a bureaucracy that is coherent, that is autonomous, and a business class that is like any other business classes, but in a situation where it wasn't able to penetrate the bureaucracy and kind of produce particular outcomes that benefit particular individuals and groups as opposed to benefit collectivities. So there is something to say about the international environment, but also that we need to recognize that internally there were reasons why certain kinds of developments were possible in some areas and not in others. The question becomes, what kind of relationships between state and their business community contributed to collectively beneficial economic outcomes, and which ones did not? I used the case of Syria because it's comparable to Egypt in this regard, but I used it primarily because I wanted to look at a country that actually was more of a laboratory case, a case in which external economic interference did not play a large role, especially by international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Syria's decisions to actually move from labor to business, or Syria's decision to implement certain neoliberal economic policies, is an internal decision, homemade, not influenced by any of the other institutions externally, and certainly not influenced by the Soviet Union at the time, because of the direction that the Soviet Union usually takes. So we cannot attribute the deteriorating economic and developmental conditions in Syria to external impact, to the external factors, to the IMF and so on, because it was made internally. At the same time, we cannot, in my view, absolve neoliberal thinking and prescriptions from responsibility, at least analytically, largely because the takeaway here, do we say takeaway? The takeaway? No, this is like normal speak. The takeaway, the takeaway here is not that neoliberalism is perfect, and that's why we cannot really, find fault in it. It's a serious fault because it's a local issue. No, on the contrary, neoliberal prescriptions have been problematic, whether or not they are implemented properly, as in the case of Egypt, where they were not implemented properly. And some of my colleagues and I argue all the time whether it was the fault of the Egyptian state or whether it's basically the neoliberal prescriptions themselves. In the case of Syria, because they were not adopted, or at least imposed on Syria, it actually went the same route. This is evidence that neoliberalism is not just bad prescriptions. It's really the expression of a privileged class of people within any context, whether it's local, regional, or international. So the changing alliances in Syria that produced neoliberal economic policies reflected the power and interest of those who were at the top, and those were comparable and complementary to neoliberal prescriptions elsewhere. So that is something that I wanted to do, but at least we could avoid saying or prevent someone from saying these were imposed. It was Syria's actual ingrown, homegrown decision-making. In the Syrian case, these formal networks comprised of state officials, the state bourgeoisie, and big business, more so than the business community as a whole. They've hijacked the process of economic liberalization in the 1980s and 1990s, probably starting in 1986, and then benefited themselves, as I shared earlier, at the expense of the Syrian consumer, the health of the Syrian economy, and the developmental potential of Syria. The causes, which in political science are called independent variables of this process, is that the structural context conditioned or provided two conditions for this actually to take place in the case of Syria. First, we have a legacy of mistrust between the regime and the business community historically, whereby there was an animosity and antagonism, not necessarily between Alawis and Sunnis or between just the upper classes and the lower classes. It was a regional antagonism, which we are actually interestingly witnessing the opposite today. There was an antagonism between the countryside and the urban metropolitan cities. The countryside included Sunnis, Christians, Alawis, Ismailis, Druze, and otherwise. The cities, of course, included a mixture as well, but it was dominated by the urban Sunni establishment. This legacy actually is what brought to power the minoritarian Baathist leadership in the early 1960s. However, this minoritarian Baathist leadership, which included actually some Sunnis and non-Alawis, progressively became dominated in terms of personnel at the top by Alawis. But as I say repeatedly, it was a regime that is increasingly dominated by Alawis at the top in terms of constituency. Therefore, the regime has a Alawi constituency, but it doesn't produce Alawi policies, akin to apartheid South Africa, where the policies reproduce the power of only white people as opposed to everyone else. Now, secondly, the continuous inflow of external rent from oil and aid. This is very important to understand because there's not very much that's quite different in Syria from other cases in the region or elsewhere in the developing world. But the existence of these two variables forced a particular kind of collaboration that I call collusion between the state and the business community, because as a result of the antagonism and as a result of the ability of the state to actually be autonomous because of this external inflow of oil and aid, the state had, in the case of, well, under Hafiz Assad in 1970, when he captured power, he decided to establish a détente with the conservative business community in Syria internally, and a détente with the conservative Arab regimes like Saudi Arabia in order to stay afloat. But the manner in which the détente internally took place was colored by the legacy of antagonism and the ability of the state progressively to actually become autonomous financially from most of society. So the connection between state and business was, or couldn't have been, formal, couldn't have been ubiquitous, couldn't have been institutionalized, and couldn't have been with the entire business community, largely because the Syrian regime had suffered, the Syrian Baath had suffered in Syria had suffered in 1961 from a reversal of a more leftist coalition, even though it was not to the, basically to the liking of most Syrians with Abdel Nasser and under the UAR. In 1961, the liberal, more urban, more establishment polity in Syria reversed the United Arab Republic Union in 1961 by force through a coup, and re-established the liberal trend that started somewhere in the 1950s, 40s, and late 40s and 50s. The Baath Party, and specifically the Baathist leadership under Salah Jadid and Assad, wanted never to repeat this ever again, which means that the marginalization of the business community had to take place in a more severe manner, and colluding or collaborating with the business community had to proceed in such a way where the business community would never be able to benefit collectively and mount another coup, because they demonstrated that they could. Hence, the harsh nature of the Baath Party and the approach that the Baath Party took in the 1960s, as opposed to other more socialist Arab nationalist regimes, including Abdel Nasser. Assad, when he came to power, decided, along with the establishment, the Syrian regime establishment, because it's never one person, even if it's Hafiz Assad, they decided to actually bring together a coalition of sorts by connecting with business moguls selectively and informally in a way that prevents the business community as a whole from actually entering the system officially, just like the NDP did, for instance, in Egypt. That was a no-no in Syria because the regime felt it could not handle that incorporation as a result of these legacies that I suggested and the power of the business community. And as a result, we have a distorted form of economic development based on state-business collaboration in the informal realm that is selective, that does not benefit the business community and hence investment across the board, and that actually does not even benefit the state as a state, because the state had to use or provide special incentives and privileges and distinctions to the business community, or at least parts of it, in order to actually keep Syria afloat. The cost of this was to deprive the state coffers from the kinds of taxes and the kinds of benefits and extractive benefits that the state in any country usually has. So, in other words, that explains structurally why this union or this collusion was so costly for another 40 years to come. The precise, there's no breaking point, but the only breaking point was 2005 when under Bashar Assad, after consolidating his rule, after Assad died in 2000, it took 3 to 4 years to consolidate rule in Syria. And of course, consolidating rule in Syria doesn't, means something specific. It means you are capable of shuffling the heads of security apparatuses, period. The ability to shuffle the heads of security apparatuses and bring about a leadership that supports the regime is key in consolidating rule in Syria, because authority from the 1960s to somewhere in the early 1980s was completely transformed in Syria from first the Baath Party after its rule in 1963, to the army under Salah Jadid and Hafiz Assad in 1966 to 1970. And when Assad take over, this authority that was transferred from the Baath Party to the army was transferred until today to the security apparatuses. This is where authority and power lies. This is the locus of the regime's power today. And the rest continue to be empty shells that are imbued with meaning when it's needed, such as in year 2000, when the constitution had to be changed to accommodate the age of Bashar Assad. The party was actually revived. In fact, it was revived in 1998 when Assad began to prepare Bashar for a succession, not knowing that he was going to go that early. That's why it took a few years for Bashar to actually consolidate power. Going back to 2005, this is the moment when the Syrian regime, for the first time in 32 years, was able to shift the political economy of Syria from a socialist kind of political economy, people say semi-socialist, Arab socialist, what have you, to what is called a social market economy, which is a very sloppy combination between having market institutions and sort of a state economy of sorts with watered down policies. And that, in fact, exacerbated and sped up the discontent in Syria, largely because the state was capable, or the regime, not was capable, was basically reflecting its social alliances and its interest in a particular mode of development, and began to slowly withdraw subsidies and reduce subsidies at a time when the Syrian population was more impoverished than ever. More than 25 to 30% at the time were under the poverty line. Unemployment was high. Jobs were no longer sufficient to make ends meet, and people's purchasing power was being eaten up by inflation by the year. At that moment, in 2005, when the state began to withdraw subsidies on food, which was the last thing that people kind of were dependent on, whereby at least you have your home, you have subsidized food, your salary does not have to be magnificent to make ends meet. When you began to take that away, starting with food, but then going to gas later on, a few years later, the kind of animosity that developed and discontent, differentially speaking, in Syria was magnificent, and it actually reached a climax in 2008 and 2009 as at the level of response to these economic policies, or at least at the level of being affected by these economic policies. However, a couple of things first exacerbated this and then mitigated them. I'll talk about the issues that exacerbated the problem. First, in 2003, we had a magnificent drought in Syria that, as I shared, produced more than 1.2 to 1.5 million migrants that actually flooded all cities in Syria. The big cities were able to absorb the migration because they were powerful, had a better infrastructure and higher standard of living. The smaller cities could not absorb this migration. Hence, you have a destitute position in the countryside, and a slightly less destitute situation in smaller cities, and an okay situation in the big cities, especially Damascus and Aleppo. And that explains to a large extent why the revolution started in the countryside, is most intense in the countryside, and will continue to be strongest in the smaller cities that actually became today the hub of the revolution for various reasons. Now, on the other hand, what allowed the state or the regime to have some modicum of stability are usually, which is basically the luck of the regime at some level, usually other players screwing up, or situations sort of somehow fitting the Syrian regime's interests. First, the Iraq War, which devastated Iraq and brought it back to some other century, has the fraudulent, I might say, Iraq War, has actually created a sense of, among Syrians, not of appreciation for authoritarianism, but an appreciation for a stable status quo. And that survived for a few years. Make no mistake, it wore off in the mid-2000s. 2006, 2007, it wore off. Other things began to come into the picture. The second issue is the killing of Al-Hariri and the response, especially in Lebanon, not just against the regime, but also against the Syrian people. created this really weird and odd connection between the regime and the people for a moment. But it was significant in the sense that it was tied to turbulence in the region from which Syria was actually free. And that gave the regime some sort of political capital for a few years. Beginning in 2008, we began to see, or 2009, we began to see further deterioration, which I was saying earlier would have resulted in mass mobilization. This deterioration was interrupted before mass discontent reached the cities. The one thing that prevented the cities from actually catching the bug of discontent is another fortuitous development, and that is the amount of capital that came from Iraq to Syria after the Iraqi war, where people with money and capital brought their resources to Syria, bought real estate, infused the Syrian, especially Aleppo and Damascus, with lots of capital. That kind of revived the metropolitan cities' ability to withstand various shocks, including the urbanization that took place as a result of the drought. And that largely explains why you see today, even though the revolution is reaching Damascus and Aleppo, you see today that these cities are relatively stable. And if you're following blogs, or if you're looking at following independent journalists, or have friends that are taking pictures and videos for you, you see that life is not completely normal, but has a modicum of normalcy, and it is not disconnected to these facts that I shared with you. So that's a bit of a tangent, because I really do not want to go through this entire slide, this entire PowerPoint, because it will take a long time. The third factor that explains what has been happening in Syria is what I shared with you earlier. It's something that's conspicuous by its absence, and that is the lack of external and domestic, the influence of external and international financial institutions. Now, I will move from this point to talk about the fines, and then perhaps we'll have a discussion. The breakdown I discussed earlier, the narrative I've discussed, and this is basically a chart of what was happening between the regime and the business community throughout. Next, I'll discuss the findings of the book, I'll summarize the theoretical and empirical findings. First, this is a situation of the networks, a typical pyramidal structure of networks that combines three elements. Networks are basically, in Syria, have a pyramid structure whereby each pyramid represents one small network, which could actually be connected to other networks. But then within every network, as a result of the state-business collusion in a particular context, you needed first a capitalist or an entrepreneur or somebody that actually has business skills. You also needed a bureaucrat in order to get things done in the mammoth that is called the Syrian bureaucracy. But those two cannot actually move and cannot survive or sustain their relationship without the third and most important part, and that is somebody within the security apparatuses, or within the coercive apparatus, or within the party, or within the army, or within the top leadership. They needed someone powerful from these areas who can actually guarantee the transgression of the law with impunity. That was key, and it's key elsewhere as well. But in Syria, it is key in such a way where if you are investing $2 million, nobody will pay attention to you. Do whatever you want. You can trade in crystal meth and coke, do what you want. But the moment you hit a threshold of investment, like, depends on the year. Earlier it was 5 million, more recently it was 10 million, and even more recently it was $20 million. Once you get to these levels of investments, you actually cannot proceed without a partner from the state, from the state itself, like a state official who's powerful enough to guarantee that you can transgress the law, and perhaps more importantly for business people, to guarantee that you will not be stripped out of your capital and out of your resources. That was a key element, and the fact that this was a key element made the entire notion of entrepreneurship and economic development in Syria subject to state power, which means it's going to be inefficient, it's going to be corrupt, and it's not likely to produce added value to the economy in terms of labor, exports, employment, exports, and any kind of R&D, research and development. So you had the passive party, which was power. It's passive in the sense that it did not get involved in the business for the most part, but it actually guaranteed transgression of the law. You had the active party, which was the bureaucracy, working really hard in order to get things done in Syrian bureaucracy. The red refers to the public sector component, and the green refers to the private sector component, which is the active party that includes capital, entrepreneurs, people in the chambers of commerce, and what have you. This three-way interaction I had before I submitted even the dissertation. I had this part of a larger network where things were connected through like one or two of these parts. For instance, the same business person can be in another network, and the same security strongman can also be in another network. And it's very interesting how they work, because this guy would be at the center of everything and would be involved in so many networks and can actually substitute others. In other words, when the deputy minister for economic affairs in the bureaucracy is rotated or is fired or is, shot, or in the case of the prime minister, Zobi, who killed himself, he shot himself 2 or 3 times at the head. That was a joke. But he was found, he committed suicide by shooting himself several times in the head. It's a joke, but the autopsy shows one thing, but then it was called suicide. Okay, so these guys can be rotated, because this graph is modular. You can come in and out. The security component stays, and that's presents dynamism, because it keeps going, because a lot of people are willing to partake in this corruption. And secondly, it actually creates a situation where you can play off people against one another to the extent that they don't play along. And that's very important, because some people in Syria want to work with the regime, but don't want to compromise too much. And once the regime senses this is the case, and they're likely to go their independent route or are beginning to talk with other business people, they automatically discard it. That state of affairs continued until the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s. However, in the book, I talked about something very delicate, which actually would have produced interesting outcomes in time. And that is, until the 1990s, the relationship between state and business was kind of balanced. After the 1990s, you began to see the business community not as a group that is coherent, but a group that has a lot of capital, a lot of power. Their bargaining and leverage with the state began to change. They were no longer just the weakest party that would just take anything. They became influential in making decisions indirectly, simply by stating their preferences. So it's very interesting that we think of the Assad regime or the authoritarian regimes as all powerful. They're not all powerful. Things were happening internally that continued to support the regime, but internally the balance between regime and the business community was no longer very lopsided. In fact, what allowed it not to be so lopsided is not just that the business community was actually acquiring more capital, it's also that the state bourgeoisie themselves, state officials themselves, beginning in the late 80s and early 1990s, began to go themselves into business through partnerships, but in the mid to late 1990s, their offspring, their sons and daughters, went into business in a big way, which meant two things. First of all, the economy became more important as an arena of society where things happen, where wealth can somewhat generate power, and where people from within the state's officials sort of circle were actually making it happen. In other words, the offspring of state officials, of say the defense minister, the Class family, or the Haddad family, these people, these younger people, have not suffered through what their parents suffered through in order to get where they're at. Their thinking is different, their worldview is different. Their ability to compromise on various issues also is very different. Make no mistake, these are not necessarily people who are sort of quote-unquote more respected in the Syrian community. They just have a more liberal approach to life, which has its negative consequences regionally. For instance, their view towards the United States' role in the region or Israel is far more lax and laid back than their fathers, who are criminals but actually understand regional and world politics in a little bit more cynical, and in the Middle East the right way. So these folks became a very interesting conduit to strengthening the economy as an alternative source of upward mobilization in Syria in terms of economic power and in terms of political power. So we began to see in Syria by 2005 not just a decision by Bashar al-Assad to move into the social market economy, but the entire socio-economic structure of the leadership was changing to favor that approach. And it began to dilute a lot of the quote-unquote radicalism that has already been diluted in the 70s and 80s, but even further because the state was becoming less and less important as the sole manner in which you actually make it in Syrian society. This process would have taken a long time. It wouldn't have ended in 2012 or 14. What I'm trying to say is that these slow-moving socio-economic processes are neglected by the sensationalist media, and I would argue by the sensationalist scholarship that's taking place, in my view, in Europe and the United States as well. Not across the board, but there's too much emphasis on questions of what is Bashar like and where he was educated and really silly things like that at the expense of serious analysis. So that process was interrupted, but it was moving, and we will stop here. Here we are looking at the sources of economic networks which come from the public sector and the private sectors, which produce these networks. I will be satisfied with this just as a way of sharing what these networks look like, how they developed, and how the balance internally changed. And when the balance changed, didn't mean that the state was losing. It just meant that there was a lot more negotiation and a lot more consideration not for business people themselves, but the consideration here was for capital. In other words, the structural power of capital in Syria was increasing in such a manner where it became a force in and of itself over and beyond what Bashar and Maher and Asif and Mohammed Nasif and all of these people wanted. It was actually more of a variable. It didn't determine Syrian development, but it was no longer a variable that you could subjugate and subordinate simply because you are a dictator. And these are also things that are important to understand, which we are seeing play a role today with the business communities, very strong, at the top level of the business community, very strong support for the regime, even if it's silent, even if it's... Absolutely. Do you want me to repeat everything?
No.
Okay. So this is important to recognize today why Syria, for instance, Aleppo and Damascus have actually been somewhat spared so far. My take is, and you will find my take in a piece that I wrote for Marip that will come out soon. My take is not that this is going to allow the regime to survive forever. On the contrary, my take is once you see splits, if those splits happen before a bigger breakdown, once you see splits within the top business community in Aleppo and Damascus and defections and arrests, because we have not seen one business mogul arrested since the beginning of the uprising. Once you see these things, it is a good signal, an indicator to start counting down in Syria, because usually capitalists are really great indicators, of what's happening. They are smarter than all of us, not because they have higher IQs, but something about their relationship to capital and their love for capital makes them extremely calculating. And when these people, as a result of, and they're actually quite conservative and some would say cowardly, I'll choose the word conservative, just in case I become really rich and then, I just want to be conservative, not coward. They're very conservative, so when they begin defecting, it's time to begin counting down, because they probably are seeing something that causes them to do that. Let me go to the findings. There are a few findings that I would like to share. The first empirical finding, because there are theoretical findings, is that this research reveals the complexity and ambiguity of the private sector. In the case of Syria, people have said that the private sector, and I have said also written, that the private sector, I don't want to be confined. The private sector is actually has grown in the 1990s to actually outstrip the public sector. In the late 1980s, the private sector controlled about 30% of the economy, the gross fixed capital formation, which is the economy at some level, and the private sector and the public sector controlled 65 to 70%. After 6 years, this figure was reversed. And it's very important. Oh, there we go. So there we go. The public and private share of capital formation in Syria changed from 85 to 1993. In 85 it was 34%, in 93 it was 65%. But if you break down this, can you see this green? Is this clear enough, the green? Or should I turn this lights off? All right, not much better. So is this clear, green and red? Okay, so in the green you see like 65% was controlled in 1993 by the private sector. However, if you break down the social carriers of this new private capital, you find out that, well, yeah, the public sector actually is the regime. And you can see the picture of the late Hafez Assad. But if you break down the components of the 65% of the private sector that actually dominated, you also see the regime in the background. Because, no, I'm serious. You see that? I didn't do this, it crept up. The thing is that the private sector in Syria, as you know from certain names like Rami Makhlouf, but Rami Makhlouf is just one person. If you consider the largest and most strategic assets in the private sector, they are either owned, controlled, or partnered with state officials, or what I call para-officials. What's a para-official? The president's wife, the president's cousin, the vice, people who are connected to the regime officials, and they actually, as social carriers, are beholden to the regime. So the content of the private sector, the social carriers of the private sector, over and beyond the legal ownership is private, a private citizen. Rami Makhlouf can be a private citizen, but he's beholden to the regime. So the social carriers of most of the private sector, or the plurality of it, are still themselves regime officials or para officials or offspring, which means that even with this change to the private sector, which is like a success story for the IMF, does not really change anything in terms of the actual economic policies, policy making, and everything else in the country in terms of this liberal conception that if you move to the market and you move to the private sector, people will become more autonomous, and then they will actually be pushing the boundaries of authoritarianism and so on. Not so. Actually, it strengthens authoritarianism. It reproduces the power on more legitimate basis. Okay, so the second empirical finding is that, very quickly, is that the legacy of mistrust persisted in Syria through election and promotion of particular patterns of election and promotion and recruitment of particular people from particular backgrounds. So that did not actually allay or pacify the other side throughout the years. It actually made it even more problematic, even after the massacre of Hama in 1982. Thirdly, the new policies in Syria that emerged from 1986 until recently have reproduced the winners through the mechanism I just showed you, because it because the private sector was dominated by players that are not really truly private. Even if you want to consider that a success story, when really truly independent private citizens dominate, which I don't, but we don't even have to go there. The private sector was dominated by public officials and their offspring and relatives. And that kind of reproduced the winners from prior arrangements, which means it did not change anything. The corollary finding is that the new upper class, in the region, in my view, has become a sort of a thing that combines political and economic elite. And this new, what I call the new nexus of power, is my next research focused on Egypt, where we look at the transition in the Arab world from the 1950s and 60s in terms of who the dominant classes were and who the dominant powers were, which was much more so of a populist coalition, at least in the 60s, all the way to the 2010s, where we are beginning to see a new coalition emerging, which will continue to be powerful whether or not we have revolutions. And this is why I do not call them revolutions, and they are barely regime changes. They're not even regime changes. The only place where there is a regime change is in Libya, where the regime was decimated, and that doesn't mean that the outcome is delicious either. But in the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, we don't have regime change. We have the departure of the head of state and the continuation of the regime under a nicer, softer emballage. Okay, I will not go to the attributes of the different parts of the Syrian business community, the old bourgeoisie, state bourgeoisie, rentier bourgeoisie, independent bourgeoisie, and petit bourgeoisie. But what do you call it? This graph is in the book. It looks at the different alliances with the state of different members of the business class, and it looks at the not just their position with the vis-a-vis the regime, but the nature of the position, whether it's strategic or organic. Strategic relationship with the regime means you're for the regime, like most of the business community today, the big ones, because they benefit from the regime, but they're not organically connected to it. These will be the ones who will defect in Aleppo and Damascus in due time. But those who are organically connected to the regime, like the actual offspring, most of them at least, not all of them by the way, some for instance in the Tlass family have actually left the regime altogether, but most are organically connected to the regime for the simple reason, and that is once people like the top regime officials, quote unquote, are, sorry to say this, if they are slaughtered, the other guys are going to be slaughtered whether or not they leave the regime or confess or do anything. So it's almost rational. It is rational. The conceptual and methodological findings are three, and I will stop there. First, the book reveals, or I hope it reveals, the importance of network analysis, particularly the question of agency. So historically, we have been used to looking at the state or society or societal groups as agents of change, as variables that explain outcomes. And that's problematic, because sometimes the agents of change are not that crystal clear. In fact, the state and society, the state or state-centered approaches have failed to explain what happened in Syria. Society-centered approaches focusing on the power of the business community or the bourgeoisie also failed to explain what happened in Syria, or in Egypt, in my view, and other places, including Southeast Asia. They fail to explain because there are outcomes that are not reflective of their interests. For instance, the state is being robbed of hundreds of millions of tax dollars every year in these countries. So the state is not benefiting, the regime is benefiting. And the regime as a whole probably is not benefiting because it includes army, bureaucracy, party, security services, and top leadership. Most are benefiting. Some are benefiting a lot, and some are not benefiting at all. So even the regime is not benefiting. So we cannot use state-centered approaches to explain outcomes, and it's largely because we are going to find that some outcomes do not reflect these interests. Same thing with the business community. The business community is not benefiting, only parts of it are benefiting. So society-centered approaches are also inadequate. Hence, network analysis presents networks, which is the connections between different people from different institutions and places and classes. This becomes an alternative conceptualization of agency that explains outcomes that are insufficiently explained by other approaches. And this is basically the analytical contribution of this book in terms of network analysis. The second is the implications of trust for institutional and economic development. And this is really interesting. In regular literature, we actually find that it focuses on the effect that institutions have on trust between players. In the Syrian case, and many others like it, we witness, or tells us the story about what happens when mistrust informs institutional development. So it's not about how institutions produce trust or mistrust, which is sort of the liberal, pro-democracy literature tells us all the time. But this looks at mistrust in society and how it produces certain institutions that are quite problematic. Okay. Third, I tried to establish the links between trust networks and institutions in a way that combined economic sociology, new institutionalism, which is an eclectic approach to understanding outcomes. In political science, this is kind of frowned down upon because they are not political science models. But seriously, political science is a combination of other sciences. And I really shouldn't be saying this before I get tenure, but it could be a very fluffy, that's not always, but it could be a very fluffy discipline if you don't really take seriously where the discipline gets its intellectual antecedents and theories from. And in many ways, they come from sociology and to an extent, economics. And in this case, economic sociology. And I think that without being eclectic in this manner, political science, the domination of political science will continue to fail to explain what is happening in the region, just like it failed to explain what is likely to happen in Iraq after the invasion and so on. So this book basically becomes a study of how state-business relations in a developing country like Syria produce polarization at various levels, specifically between rich and poor and between the countryside and the city, because investments went to the city and left the countryside completely to basically to rot, because investment in the city produces quick returns and high returns as opposed to the countryside, and the new social alliances favored these kinds of investments, and of course, largely speaking, polarized society. Who got hurt the most? People in the countryside, who actually were the first to go out and face bullets with their bare bodies. And that's not a reflection of some sort of cultural thing or factor. That's a reflection of having very little to lose. And that's why the Syrian revolution started in the countryside and is still considered strongest in the countryside, having moved to the cities, however, the smaller cities that actually have a lot more resources. So I will stop here, and hopefully we can discuss both the book and what's happening today, if you like.
Great.
We have almost 25 minutes for questions. That's great.
Yes, please.
You had talked a little bit about some of the generational differences you were starting to see offspring of particular people in some of these different categories. So what if you talk about that a little more? We hear a lot about like generation and youth and all of that being this important driver supposedly for some of the revolutions. So I was wondering what else about generational change?
The generational change I was talking about referred to the people on the other side, not on the side of the revolution. These guys are the ones who now dislike the revolution the most, because just as they were getting to have their first or second baby and their better car or their better house, they actually confronted what's happening today. So these guys are really upset. The generational question on the other side is that 40% at least of the Syrian population is between 15 and 25. And they see very little future. We can talk about, a lot of people talk about these things because, it's trendy. But if you look at the numbers, every single year, 230 to 250,000 Syrians enter into the job market. At the same time that less than 100,000 jobs are available, and these are jobs that are not always full-time, that are not even always part-time. They are like, it's the total number of jobs. The rest either go into the informal economy or come in and out so much that it's not really considered a job. So these people know that they are going into nothingness, and that's why a lot of them leave, and that's why many of them end up joining, opposition movements underground that are not very effectual before, but now we are seeing them becoming very effective because they have very little to lose, especially in the countryside where you cannot really even rely on any kind of surplus from extended family, because it's just not there, and you cannot even rely on your crops because they're not even there. So the situation is bleak, and in that sense. However, in my view, one of the most important developments or aspects of this revolution, which there are two, but one relates to generations and the other relates to politics proper. On the generations side, we have seen a remarkable democratist approach among the younger population in Syria and in Egypt, and the volunteerism that is really fascinating. It's really fascinating to see that, for instance, the coordinating committees in Syria, which are made up of people largely 18 to 25 years old and sometimes a little older, have actually, some people say they've derailed the revolution because they keep deliberating on things before actually coming up with a decision. They've been extremely democratist in the sense that they want a new society, even in resisting the state or fighting against the state or defending themselves against a brutal state or regime. They actually were adhering to rules and procedures set by themselves almost to the T. And that is viewed not only in the meetings that I haven't been to, but I have had access to them, and things have been reported to me because I know people in these committees. But also in the voluntarism in neighborhoods, which we have also seen in Egypt, we've also seen in Syria. Unfortunately, the Syrian situation was such that this voluntarism, moved to militarism, perhaps in a rational way because of the brutality of the crushing by the state. In Egypt, it didn't have the chance to actually move to something worse, so it remains pretty. But it remains pretty not because people are different in Egypt. It remains pretty because the assault was different. Plus, the Egypt revolution. I mean, as I say usually, if you went to the Bahamas in January and you came back in February, Hosni was gone. It was very fast. Whereas in Syria, it's been in 2 weeks, it'll be a year. Exactly in 2 weeks, it'll be a year. So in that sense, we are likely to see a generation that is far less worrisome than people say. I mean, there are elements, and the more the regime, crushes, the more there'll be problematic, obscurantist elements. Call them Salafis, call them Islamists, call them like rigid, whatever. Call them whatever you like. And I don't support actually this tremendous fear of the Islamists. I'm not crazy about the Islamists or the Christianists or anything that connects mildly to religion when it comes to politics, or even I'm not crazy about rigid Marxism when it comes to politics or rigid anything. My statement on these issues is that these folks that are concerned about the extremists, they have something, there's a kernel of truth to it, especially increasingly speaking. But it's definitely extremely exaggerated. And I think this generation is going to hold these people in check, just like people are held in check in the United States. I mean, we have, even in a society where you can express yourself and say whatever you want, we still have a lot of crazy people, a lot of kooks who just want certain people to leave or die or what have you. But they're held in check. And I think Syrian society, with this new generation, is going to hold people in check much more so than people think. And the slaughtering that the Christians are worried about and the Alawis are worried, well, I can't speak for the Alawis because they might actually be slaughtered, unfortunately. There's a lot of sectarianism growing right now, specifically towards the Alawis. But this Christian community, which is sort of the community that usually is sort of the swing community, does not have as much as it thinks it has to worry about. I think the Alawi community, especially certain people living in certain areas, have reason to worry. But the generational question is actually ultimately, I think, positive. Yes, sir.
On that note, on sectarianism and the worries of the Alawi community, you said earlier talk that that the regime has an Alawi constituency without Alawi policies, and you also mentioned in your book, your rejection of cultural arguments. But reading the book, I got the
You read the book?
I read most of the book, not all of it. But I got the impression that you make it sound almost as though a coincidental confluence of factors that has led to the minoritarian makeup of the regime. And I was wondering, how can you effectively say, oh, it's not this, but it's that? Does my question make sense?
It's not.
How can you effectively separate the cause from effect of the minoritarian makeup of the regime? And also, real quickly, a second question has more to do with, I guess, present concerns. You talked about Riyadh Saif, I think is his name.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, I feel like I've heard recently, a couple of months ago, maybe he had a factory of his burned down, or textile or something like that happened to him. I was wondering if you could talk about that and what kind of implications that would have.
What's your name?
Austin.
Austin, do you hate America? I'm just joking. Okay. So easy to run for president. Okay. So, I mean, look, Syria is a fantastic case to study a number of things, including the effects of colonialism on political development. Colonialist powers in Syria, well, the French colonial power in Syria played a magnificent role in doing what is very smart, which is divide and conquer. One of the things that they have done is that they've sponsored some minorities and supported some minorities in various ways, tried to offer them the promise of autonomy and so on, but also pushed them through the ranks of the military because they were considered safe. One of the, of course, the Alawis were some of the beneficiaries of this. And they, along with some Christians who also benefited from this, and some Muslims from the countryside, the French were actually smarter than some of the Orientalists today, writing from the comfort of their own offices, because they actually did not distinguish as much between Alawis, Sunnis, and Christians. They looked at the countryside and they actually empowered some of these people and push them through the ranks of the military. So ultimately, of course, because the majority of people in the countryside, or at least if you do the math, they're not Sunnis, although they include a large number of Sunnis, they actually ended up having very powerful positions in the military and were able to make things happen through the secret committee that was formed between Assad and his friends in the late 1950s in response to the UAR. Those people came together trying to put an end, first of all, to the UAR at some level, and to the dominance of the urban establishment historically, especially for certain minorities that were actually most hard hit for decades, some say centuries, by the urban establishment, which is largely Sunni. So coming to power of this coalition ultimately brought to power a minoritarian-based regime. This minoritarian-based regime included Christians, Druze, and Sunnis, and Ismailis, and so on. In 1966, a lot of these minorities were actually, phased out or eliminated for the most part, and then you were left with mostly Alawis at the very top. But the fiercest fights within the Baath were actually between Alawis, just like the fiercest fights in Lebanon historically in the past 30 years were between the Maronites on the one hand and between the Shi'is on the other. So it's very important there is sectarianism, but it's very important not to reduce everything to sectarianism, because politically the fight between Assad and Jadid was over to what extent do you push land reforms. Assad wanted to preserve the land of the middle peasants. Jadid wanted to also, go through the middle peasants' assets and liquidate them or distribute them. And that is what characterized the biggest conflict within the rural minoritarian Baath. Assad won because he was a pragmatist. He realized that if you actually do this in a country that does not have a particular political economy and regional and international standing, the state will continue to be weak and dependent on other forces, because Patrick Steele captured it when he talked about the struggle for Syria. Syria was a pawn. He wanted Syria to actually become a player. And that's precisely what happened when he took over, and so on and so forth. So the story is a combination of class and regional animosities that produced the Baath. The Baath ended up under Assad capitalizing on this combination early on, and the reason you see Baathists, Alawis at the top levels of the Syrian regime is not just sectarianism, it's rationality. It's how do you bring in people that can be so structurally implicated in whatever you do, even if they change their minds. You make them Alawi. And that's just brilliant. I mean, it's beyond a sectarian sentiment. It's a rational sentiment, which could overlap with sectarian sentiment, but it's very nuanced. And we shouldn't take that logic too far, because in the end, most people at the top are Alawis. However, we shouldn't reduce everything to Alawism or sectarianism, because that's not what was happening. The people in Damascus streets right now, who are Druze, or some of them, or Christians, are willing to take up arms and fight for the regime, even though they have zero benefit from the regime in terms of business or whatever. So there is something that is small that remains legitimate in certain places in association with the regime. That thing is becoming narrower and narrower the more the regime kills people. But it has not gone away, and if you want to talk percentages, which nobody can ascertain, we're not talking about 5% or 3%, like in the case of Egypt, when the people that, I don't know if you know Egypt, but there were all these millions of people in Tahrir and Ismailia and Alexandria, and then in Muhandisin, that near Jamiat al-Duwal, the nice street, there were about 16 cars, really nice BMWs and Mercedes and Porsches with like the rooftop and with nice looking girls and boys, waving Hosni Mubarak's pictures. They just went around 3 times and that was it. In Syria, there is more than, by any stretch of the, if you're very conservative, there is 20% of the population that is very, very strongly attached to the regime. And if you add those who are on the fence, who kind of are not sure where they should be, they actually don't like the regime. You can get to numbers of anywhere between 25 to 35% who represent today the reason why this is protracted, the reason why the regime is not compelled to stop, because it's not seeing these numbers that we saw elsewhere, and that's very important. So it's not the cause, but it's actually an empirical observation that one makes. But it's Alawism or sectarianism is not the cause of things. I don't know if I captured all of your questions. Did I miss one?
I asked you about Riyadh Saif.
Oh, Riyadh Saif. Yeah, I mean, Riyadh Saif, I've spent a lot of time with Riyadh Saif when nobody would speak out. There were only 2 or 3 people in Syria that will speak out. And the 2 top people that spoke out in the 1990s under Assad, and Assad is not Bashar, or Bashar is not Assad. If this happened under Assad, it'll be a different story, okay, in many ways, because of his ability to command and so on and so forth. These guys, even under Assad, Riyadh Saif, but more importantly, Arif Dalila, I mean, I've learned like 80% of what I need to learn politically in terms of struggle and resistance from the man called Arif Dalila, who is still alive, who was jailed in 2001 for several years and almost died in jail. These guys spoke out and were amazingly courageous. And now, of course, both of them kind of moderated, largely because of age. But it's no wonder that this would happen to Riyadh Saif, but he's no longer as much of a player. He's now just an icon, like Michel Kilo and the other older folks. They say things, and the regime lets them say things for a very simple reason, because they're not effective. Yes, sir?
I was wondering if you could discuss the extent to which foreign investment and increased connection to the global economy was or was not a factor with these different periods of liberalization of the Syrian economy that you've discussed, especially with this new generation of people that you've talked about who grew up, whose fathers and families were the original proponents of the regime, who grew up with this more liberal mindset.
The FDI, foreign direct investment in Syria, has always been the lowest among almost all countries in the world. It's really unbelievable how low this figure was. And that's largely because the regime, was intent on preserving its security and its autonomy. The earlier title of the book is not Business Networks. The title of the book now is Business Networks in Syria, the Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience. The title I preferred, which was the dissertation title, is The Economic Price of Regime Security. Basically, how the emphasis on its own security, it had to pay an economic price and a developmental price, but I don't want to make the title too long. And that's the reason why they would not allow FDI, even under its own control, into Syria, because that can always develop into other things. Because Assad is very smart, the big one. He knew that he would, even the closest people connected to him, even the Alawis, would actually be too tempted to increase their lot if they are connected to foreign investments internally. So they stayed away. So the numbers are extremely small. They never actually affected Syria's politics. Maybe only after 2005, with the creation of, ultimately in 2009, the Damascus Stock Exchange. This was beginning to happen. What's your name? Jeremy, this was beginning to happen, you know, in 2009, 2008 and 9, after the creation of private banks, holding companies, private banks, holding companies, and the Damascus Stock Exchange. But we really didn't catch it. And the reason was why it was beginning to happen, because these folks are getting older, and the Bashar generation, you know, I mean, these people just wanted a different kind of lifestyle and a different kind of economy than their parents, and they really wanted to slowly make the state retreat from the public realm and have the private sector dominate. Just like, you know, it is in England and America, the private sector dominate, wealth is converted to power, and the Baathists and the party apparatchiks or the, you know, the old guard never wanted that. So there was always a conflict, but it was going in that direction because the structure of capital, the power of the structure of capital was increasing. So we were headed in that direction of more FDI. It was just interrupted by the uprising. And also I wanted to say something about, I forget, but I wanted to say something about, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Yes,
and
yes.
then, And then there are copies of this book outside.
Okay. I'll take a couple and then I'll answer them quickly, because since there are two hands. Is that okay? The two hands.
2 minutes.
Okay.
My question has to do with what ties business networks, aside from the practical financial considerations and of course needing to work with the regime. Is it familial, ethno-religious, regional? And tying on to that, if it is familial, and I like your point about looking at what's potentially going to be happening, and if the business networks are starting to go into the fray, we know the regime might be falling. But if you could pick out any particular families within those business networks that could have an impact.
That's why I'll get to your question, sir, in a second. That's why the networks are successful, and that's why the Syrian support for the regime now is successful, because it's not about families or the family of the president or certain families. It's cross-cutting in terms of sect, region, and social class. And some of these people in the networks used to be truck drivers that you would run the black market route from Lebanon, Turkey to Syria. Truck drivers who now have like $800 million in the bank, and others whose fathers and grandfathers and themselves, you know, actually eat with a gold, not silver, gold spoon. So you have the old bourgeoisie and the truck driver now who are part of the networks, as well as the offspring of the state. So this is why the networks are very powerful, and there is something really deep that connects them, because they actually were, in many ways, there was some sort of egalitarianism, like really weird egalitarianism, if you will, that allowed these networks to survive and to be viewed as non-sectarian. So within the realm of the supporters of the Assad regime, within the networks, there was a feeling that this is not about sectarianism, you know, this is about making Syria more productive and blah, blah, blah. And that's why we cannot really reduce those things to any particular families. There are families and people that dominate, and they are connected to the regime. They dominate not because there's a lot of them. They dominate because they dominate the big industries like telecom, free trade zones, you know, equipment for airplanes and so on. Yes, sir.
So you made the point that basically the current regime has sort of co-opted the business community.
Top levels.
Okay, like a proxy, you know, there's this network now between them. If the Syrian people are successful in overthrowing the regime and, you know, having the opportunity to change the individuals who are actually calling the shots in their country, sort of like what happened in Egypt, do you see any source of leaders in Syria which might actually bring real change, as opposed to just changing the faces?
You know what's interesting? This is a very interesting question. I'll answer very quickly. The Syrian situation is like the Libyan situation, not like the Egyptian and Tunisian situation, whereby it's very difficult to find to have an outcome that includes the regime but excludes the top leadership. This in Syria, I didn't talk about this because I'm sick of talking and repeating it. The regime in Syria is so coherent and cohesive and organic. It either stays or goes. And then you're going to have another leadership emerge. I think there is a leadership that can emerge. and I think it's far more promising than Libya. The difference between Egypt and Tunisia on the one hand and Syria on the other is that the entire Syrian regime will go, so there's opportunity for the rest to rise. It's like Libya, where there's an opportunity for the rest to rise. However, in Syria, you actually have cadres that have developed socially in very powerful ways. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi decimated everything. He didn't just decimate, as opposition, but he decimated society, civil society. I mean, Muammar is very special. In Syria, with the brutality of the regime, there is a vibrant, fantastic society in Syria and individuals. However, my fear and your fear, no, not your fear, I don't know, that's your fear. My fear, and what I hope your fear would be, is for this problematic leadership that sometimes speaks in the name of the entire revolution, that's headed by Burhan Ghalioun, unfortunately, who's used to be sort of a mentor or a friend of mine years ago, but not him, but others. This ilk that's going to come back to Syria after decades is definitely not going to be it. It's going to be, or it should be, someone from the local context, from domestic society. However, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we are looking at a really grim sort of trade-off between the Assad regime personnel and people that we call the Syrian Chalabis, like the Chalabi who came with the Americans to Iraq in 2003. During the first period. What's going to happen in the second and third periods, I do not know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Caroline.